The Life and Times of a Cultural Icon, Picture Theory, all published from University of Chicago Press, and Seeing Through Race, a brilliant book that was published by Harvard in 2012. Not to forget his stellar contribution as an editor of Critical Inquiry, one of the best journals in the academy, devoted to critical theory in arts and human sciences for 40 long years. And Mental Traveler, a father, a son, and a journey through schizophrenia, is a memoir that he's going to talk about today of a brilliant young filmmaker's 20-year struggle with mental illness. The reading will include excerpts from the memoir and discussion of how Gabriel Mitchell's effort to transform schizophrenia from a death sentence to a learning experience has inspired his father's subsequent researches into collective madness in our time. For this event, Tom will move beyond discussions of Mental Traveler to a lecture drawn from Itzikyo, Seeing Through Madness, which is very much in progress, and he's going to talk about it for the first time in the show. He will give a short account of the memoir first, and then go on to discuss the importance of transforming madness from an ill-defined vernacular term into a foundational critical concept. Today's event also includes a short film about Gabriel by his sister, Carmen Mitchell, who is with us, called Infinite Light, and Poetry and Music by his mother, composer, Janice Mitchell, who is with us too. We warmly welcome both of you on the show. So the event begins with the film by Carmen, followed by Janice reading a poem for us, and then Tom takes the stage with his presentation. Welcome all of you here. It's a wonderful privilege for all of us here at University of North Bengal to invite three of you on this show. So for the first time, for the first leg of this program, we invite Carmen to take over with the film. We are going to also show the film from our end, just a minute.
This is my brother, Gabriel Mitchell.
If I'm going to be crazy and everybody's telling me I'm crazy, then I want to be really good at it. I want to be the Michael Jordan of craziness.
In 2010, we decided to collaborate on a film about mental illness. Right, so what's today? Today is
Wednesday, December 29th, 2010.
Great. So, Gabriel, why are we doing this movie?
I guess we're just trying to get at some kind of truth.
20 years earlier, Gabriel had been diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Your son is suffering from a thought disorder. He's paranoid. He has ideas of reference. He thinks everything is a signal for him.
And he was rolling around on the living room floor with the large coat and the hat, saying, Mom, there's something inside me. I don't know what it is.
As he started to kind of process what this meant, he started interviewing everyone he knew about what mental illness is.
This is interview number one. What do you think about mental illness, mental health, and our society?
What's your name, man? Nice to meet you, Randy.
Where I would eat cornflakes and I would feel like electricity.
What do I think of mental health? I'm in favor of enlightened mental health.
When we started working together, we thought it would be interesting to examine mental illness both from the inside and from the outside.
People have been going mad at least for 3,000 years.
Madness, I think, can sometimes mean extra insight, visionary,
Touched by angels.
Does mental illness really exist? Is it a label that society has created to limit certain types of behavior? And what does it really mean to live inside of those labels?
The naming of mental disorders has an interesting history.
And I think it's helpful often to not have words for it.
No, we aren't mentally ill, we are psychiatrically challenged.
It's bad enough having the illness, but when you've got the label...
What's the word when somebody's not paranoid, but neurotic? Neurotic.
It's that fear of being cast out of society that's worse than
You sing calming vibes.
That's because I'm on tranquilizers. As far back as I can remember, I've always seen things that weren't there. And I've always been a daydreamer.
And then on June 24th, 2012, Gabriel left the project. He didn't leave a note. He left writing, he left words, he left line drawings and songs and images, stories. He left, his thoughts. I guess, he left clues.
I wrote a screenplay basically telling my whole life story.
Once upon a time, there was a beautiful young man. He left home at the age of 18 to study film. When he got there, he met a lovely young lady and they fell in love.
Most of the ideas came from dreaming, lucid dreaming while I was awake.
And he believed he saw a vision of God, and it looked like him.
I felt like I just had to start paying attention to all of these different pieces.
An anomaly rose in the vortex, an anomaly called life. And life is governed by rules. If you had a zoom lens and you dove into the heart, the very center of the grid, you'd find a square.
He knew that the whole project of squaring the circle is a symptom. No real mathematician believes you can do it anymore. My old friend Anthony Gormley, who had met Gabe and knew about his work, Anthony offered to realize this idea that Gabe had of an infinite cube.
I think he was very, very aware of the idea of the grid as I guess as a matrix through which you could see all things, this infinite cube of Gabriel Mitchell.
I never understood it while he was alive, but now it's like the grid is mine. Like I feel like I need to kind of figure it out.
And as we know, people are malleable and plastic and they can change. And they are changing. They're always changing. Even beyond the grave, they're changing. That's part of life, is that it's constantly moving.
We're all peering, trying to see him and trying to find him. But I do feel like he's in there.
Yes. So, Carmen, you can just, if you'd like to say something, if you want to take up this now.
Sure. Yeah. Hello. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. The piece that we just saw is actually an introduction to a feature film that's in progress. And it's also kind of, I think for today, it's really an introduction to Gabe and to all of the work that was inspired by his life and his struggle, including Mental Traveler by our featured guest, or as I know him, Dad. And including the compositions and poetry by my mother, Janice Gabriel Mitchell, and also, as you saw at the end, the sculpture by Anthony Gormley, The Infinite Cube. So this film was really something that Gabe and I had intended to make together originally. And it was to be about sort of a documentary about mental illness and the stigma and misconceptions surrounding it. But since he's passed, it's really become more about telling his story and examining the role of his own storytelling and his sort of fantasies and delusions in crafting a narrative for himself, in which he emerges as very much the hero and defeats his illness. I like to think of it as kind of a counter narrative to the one that he and many other people are given about what the diagnosis of schizophrenia ultimately means. And my intention with this is to really kind of fulfill Gabe's dream of showing mental illness from the inside and the outside. as both someone who is experiencing it and is also to show the perspective of the witnesses of that illness. So it is, in some ways, it's sort of a postmortem collaboration. And I think my mother, who is going to be reading some poetry, is also sort of taking it in that vein of looking at collaborations created with Gabe in a way, both during his life and after he passed. And with that, I think I will turn it over to my mother.
Okay, so this is part of the family show. Toward the end of
forward to hearing you, Janice. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Toward the end of Tom's book, Mental Traveler, it's a series of poems that I've written. And then at the very end, which I think should also be something people read and make sure they find this, it's Gabriel's email to his cousins on the death of my mother, on Grammy's death. So it's Gabriel's idea about how we preserve and kind of understand those who have passed and how they influenced us and what they mean in our lives. So it's his last word to all of us, which I think is really significant. My poetry, it's kind of what Carmen was talking about. It's we can say that it's from the view of the witness. I was trying in this also to write letters to him through poetry, trying to understand his state of mind and a lot of things that we hadn't really known that much about that were going on for him. This one poem that I'm going to read, though, is about the infinite cube, because it's a really interesting series of events between Antony and Gabriel that I think help illuminate the idea of what the cube meant and actually how it came into being. So this is called Antony and Gabriel, a chronicle of the infinite cube. London, July 20th, 2007. Antony, always curious, questioning, appreciative of young artists, sees Gabe's Desolation Row revisited. Play that again. Remarkable. Yes. Chicago, November 2010. Early evening, post-lecture. Dark, cold, windy, northerly island. I drive Antony and Gabe to the bike path there. Light jackets, no hats. They hurry to the center of the lawn. And this is where your Iron Man should go, so that when the sun rises, he'll be coming out of the lake, through the trees, and out onto the lawn. Yes, yes. 2011. Gabe thinks about cubes, how they encompass, letting in light, lawn, skies, and protect, he thinks, later, from the vortex, the swirling unknown. Or is that grandiosity, he asks slyly. 2013. Antony thinks about Gabe's plan, the infinite cube, and tells us, yes, I can create that. 2015. Inside the infinite cube, the parallel lines curve, perhaps to meet. The circle may be squared as pi travels on to infinity, where lines meet and cross into an infinite future, where there are no longer accusing voices, where one's mind and soul can be free.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you very much. Before I actually ask or invite Tom to take over, I think there was an audibility problem with which I began. I just heard a few complaints saying that I wasn't audible when I began. So, and let me introduce Tom again, because it's very important for me to do that, because I was told that probably first half of my presentation was not audible. So I repeat what I said. Of course, this should be the first time that I'm saying this, that we are welcoming our second distinguished lecture here in the Boy Lecture Series with distinguished Professor W.J.T. Mitchell, who is the Gaylord Donnelly Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, and one of the finest theorists and thinkers of our generation on media, visual art, the relations of visual and verbal representations in the culture and iconology. Mitchell is widely known for his books like image science, iconography, visual culture, and media aesthetics, Cloning Terror, The War of Images, 9/11 to the Present, What Do Pictures Want? Essays on the Lives and Loves of Images, a fantastic book, The Last Dinosaur Book, The Life and Times of a Cultural Icon, Landscape and Power, and Picture Theory, a book that I really loved. Also, Seen Through Race. All these books that I just mentioned were published by University of Chicago Press. And Seen Through Race, another beautiful book from Harvard University Press in 2012. So on that note, I invite Tom to take the stage over and begin his presentation. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you so much, Ranjan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you. I don't usually get two introductions, but I'll take them. It's fine. And let me just get started right in. I'm not going to talk about my recent book, Mental Traveler, very much. I think you got an introduction to who Gabriel was, what his ambitions were in Carmen's wonderful film. And when the full-length film is finished, that will be even more important. Mental Traveler is basically a narrative of our family, and particularly of my role living with Gabriel's schizophrenia for a 20-year period through all the stages of it. It was a shock to us when he died. We thought he had defeated his mental illness. At least I thought so. Clearly, I was mistaken. But before Gabe passed, he had enlisted me in a project, that's what I am really going to talk about. It's the project that he initiated, he inspired. So this is from the preface to this new book, which is a kind of echo of Seeing Through Race. This time it is Seeing Through Madness. And the idea is to treat madness, like race, as an object of visual culture, to ask why we want to see it, why it is made into a spectacle, but also to see past it, to see through it, to something beyond it. The book began as the background research for a film that Gabe wanted to make. He was planning a 9-hour epic surveying the entire world of madness across cultures and periods of human history. This was inspired by Godard's Histoire du Cinéma, which, as you may know, is a 9-hour film about modern history and about the history of film. And Gabe and I were part of a discussion group. We watched that film over 9 weeks, watching 1 hour each Tuesday night, and then rewatching the same hour and discussing it. But he was deeply immersed in Godard's encyclopedic approach to montage, but he wanted to apply it to the question of madness, mental illness. So what was my part to be? Well, he said, "Dad, I want you to be my image researcher. That's your job. You're an iconologist, you work with images, so I want you to make the pre-production atlas. As you know, before every film, you have to assemble all the materials for it. And so that was my job. I was supposed to assemble the materials. This would have been an encyclopedic world of representations of insanity unfolded across ancient and modern cultures, across all the visual and verbal media, and it would not have been restricted to the Western world at all. I think I can safely say that in Bengal and in India, in every part of India, madness is known about. It's shown, it's seen, and it is made into a spectacle. There is no human culture without madness. Now, clearly my pre-production atlas was an impossible job. You would have to have every language on the planet. You would have to know every culture. It was a collaborative project, and in fact, one of the things that has come out of this is a proposal for an alternative reference book. The psychiatric master reference book is called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness. Anybody who has had any contact with psychiatry knows that this enormous book, now in its 6th edition, growing by leaps and bounds as more mental disorders are discovered. But at the end of the DSM, there is a short section called Cultural Factors, and it's about things that don't fit into psychiatry. It starts with the word amok, as in they ran amok, they went crazy, and goes through all of the other obsolete and vernacular notions, dementia, hysteria, a very popular one, no longer part of the DSM. Homosexuality, inversion, used to be part of it. So what I would propose is a cultural and symbolic manual of mental illness, which will be much bigger than the DSM and will not have any clinical or psychiatric purpose. It will be there as a map of how the human mind falls into disorder, or sometimes even more dangerous, how it creates oppressive orders of various kinds with rationality, science, and technology in the service of it. If you think of the Final Solution in Germany, that would be a perfect example of rationality itself going mad. So the film that Gabriel planned, the 9-hour film, I don't think will be made, but maybe the research project behind it could be. I don't think as I said, it'll take a team to make the CSM. One person couldn't do it. But there was another aspect of it that I think can survive, and that's the idea that Gabe constantly talked about, which was how to transform madness from an individual affliction, an illness to be treated, into a framework for understanding the human condition itself. In its most radical form, the thesis is simple. What if human nature is not well defined by that popular phrase, Homo sapiens, the wise hominid, and would be better described as Homo dementia, or even more precisely, Homo amentia? I expect there'll be some resistance to this idea, which is not very flattering to our inflated self-esteem as the dominant animal group on this planet. But a moment's reflection, I think, reveals it to be the plain truth. Forget for the moment about war, poverty, famine, plague, genocide, and the other ills that flesh is heir to. Just consider the fact that the human species is now a clear and present danger to itself and others. That is the legal definition of insanity in my country, and I think in most countries, it's not a psychiatric criterion, it's just a legal definition. If somebody is out of their mind and they are a danger to themselves, they might kill themselves, or they might hurt other people. That's the criterion for confinement on the grounds of mental disorder. So what if we woke up and realized that our species is also guilty of that? It's high time for a fundamental reconsideration of madness, not only as the spectacular subject of the arts and media, but as a critical optic. It's time to see through madness in all its variations, and perhaps to see beyond it, to see it through to some form of sapience. In other words, Homo sapiens is a project yet to be accomplished. A wisdom that would go beyond techno-scientific rationality and the dead-end game known as capitalism. As the inventors of intelligent machines, perhaps it is time for the human species to reinvent itself. But now I want to take you back to the beginning and just a little flavor of the image repertoire that Gabriel began with and that I was assembling for his film. So let's go to this. Um, and okay. We knew that the modern notion of mental illness is preceded by very ancient images and narratives involving madness. One of the most famous, what you might call the earliest personification of female madness, is the figure of Cassandra, who is given the gift of prophecy by Apollo, but the curse of never being believed in her prophecies. So she knows the Trojan War is coming. She knows that Agamemnon will be assassinated, but her foreknowledge of the future is regarded as madness, and this shows her being slaughtered as she tries to ascend the Palladium to ask Athena for mercy. Greek tragedy, Greek drama would not exist without madness as a crucial theme, from Oedipus to the Trojan War, to the entire panoply of characters, including the gods themselves, who we have to recognize are always somewhat crazy. In the early or late Middle Ages, around 1600, there was a rash all across Europe of spirit possession and exorcism, which was, in a sense, the madness of the day. Here we see the exorcist forcing the demon to come out of a woman's mouth. And one question I would ask you to think about as you look at these images, including Cassandra, and this is, they often have a mad person in them, but who is really crazy here? Is it the exorcist or is it the possessed person? Exorcism itself involves a completely wild belief in spirit possession and all of the cures for it. The birth of modern psychiatry and modern treatment of the mentally ill is usually dated to around the French Revolution. This is a famous portrait of Pinel liberating the insane, a kind of parallel to the fall of the Bastille, where many mentally ill people were confined. In the 18th century, as Foucault noted long ago, the mad and the criminal were all thrown together in confinement. This is the moment when the insane are separated out for special treatment, a recognition that the mentally ill are not criminals, but need special attention. Unfortunately, the special attention they received in the 19th century was often like this: Benjamin Rush's tranquilizer chair, which was given to people who were suffering from distraction or hallucination, to try to restrain them, keep them from moving, being agitated, and keep them from seeing things, except for a very narrow opening. You can actually see this actual chair if you go to Los Angeles, go to Hollywood, to the Anti-Psychiatry Museum on Sunset Boulevard, and I don't think they'll let you sit in the chair, but you can see it for yourself. So the liberation of the insane was a mixed blessing. At least it separated them from the criminals, but it put him into a new position, which is best exemplified by the treatment of hysterical women in the late 19th century by Charcot, one of the great pioneers of psychiatry. Charcot really developed a kind of theatrical presentation of hysteria. The hysterical art in which women would go through spasms and thrust their hips into the air was so strong that they could suspend themselves between two chairs like this. This kind of scene he put on display for all male audiences in Paris. It became the sensation of late 19th century Paris. And it was really the beginning of the spectacularizing of mental illness, turning it into a dramatic spectacle, something that was also going on in opera at the same time. One final image from cinema that I thought might be useful to think about is the process known as brainwashing, which was the use of psychiatry not to cure the mentally ill, but to drive people mad. Psychiatry, if it is efficacious, with the use of drugs and conditioning, can actually turn a sane person into a mentally ill person. It can induce amnesia, mania, depression. In this case, Dr. Yen Lo, the evil Chinese psychiatrist, is inculcating them to become assassins for communist China in his secret base in North Korea. So psychiatry, a double-edged sword, sometimes confusable with torture itself, with conditioning of persons, with transforming the mind through brainwashing. My final example is from actually a few weeks ago. As you may know, we had a wild time. It was predicted by the President of the United States that there would be a wild event on January 6, 2021, to prevent the democratic transition of power. The assembled masses who invaded the US Capitol on that day were led by the QAnon shaman. The QAnon I think of as the contemporary answer to something like spirit possession and witchcraft in the early modern era. The QAnon believers think that the Democratic Party and liberals everywhere are involved in a pedophilic ring involving child pornography, sexual abuse, and cannibalism. And it's all hidden in the basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. This lunatic belief, the QAnon shaman led the way as one of the fringe groups that were actually central to the insurrection in Washington just about a month ago. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that madness is a persistent feature of humankind, but of course it's not all there is to human beings. They do beautiful things as well. They create literature, art, architecture, music. But I want to think more fundamentally about the question of Homo sapiens in the first place. What is human nature? This is a very popular book recently by Yuval Harari, which argues that sapiens arose about 70,000 years ago as a kind of minor hominid species that over a period of 30,000 years wiped out all of its rivals. The rivals were things like the Neanderthals and other groups, which were hominid. They were not apes. They were not exactly primates. They were very similar. They were erect hominids. But all of them came to an end. They were all extinguished. Why was that? Harari's answer is cognitive achievements, the ability to manipulate symbols, to write, to calculate, and to reason. Now, of course, there was something else going on in Homo sapiens, that is, as a Homo symbolicum, somebody who used words, images, sounds, not only to convey calculated reasons, but also to stir up emotions. Homo symbolicum was the mad animal at the same time. And a crucial speculation by Harari is that when sapiens encountered Neanderthals, the result was the first and most significant ethnic cleansing campaign in history. That is, we are the product, as a species, of using our intelligence, our ability to plan ahead, our ability to innovate with technology. What we used that for was to survive as a species and wipe out all the competitors. A very interesting image in Harari's book that haunts me is this speculative reconstruction of a Neanderthal child, which to me looks like just the nice little kid down the block. And I have been asking myself, why did Harari put this in? I mean, it's a totally speculative image. And it's quite different from the old-fashioned representations of the Neanderthals as sort of ape-like hominids. This makes it look much more like genocide, ethnic cleansing, was what was at stake in the survival of Homo sapiens. All that to say that the creation of death, of mass death, and the extinction of rival species or even companion species, since there was some intermarriage or reproduction between us and the Neanderthals, DNA evidence shows that. In spite of that, somehow we have gone on to dominate the planet, and at the present rate of extinction, we're wiping out about 150 species a day. That's why I began by saying we may be on the endangered species list ourselves, but certainly we're getting rid of a lot of others. Okay, so let me turn now to the question of the relation of madness and mental illness. A lot of this book is going to be inspired by Nietzsche's remark in Beyond Good and Evil, that insanity in individuals is something rare, which is true. I mean, my idea of madness as a foundational form in the human species does not mean that everybody is mentally ill. In fact, most people aren't. Although there's lots of statistics showing that the number of people who are mentally ill is increasing in our time for some reasons that we could get into. But the idea of the individual as opposed to the group, the party, the nation, and the epoch, that at that level in group psychology, madness, insanity is the rule. So one way to depict this is with a very simple Venn diagram in which we see that mental illness is a small subset of what you might call the normal madness of the human species. That is, its tendency to use its intelligence for destruction, for murder, mass murder especially, for injustice, for tyranny, for all kinds of social deformations that sometimes go under the rubric of politics. So if we elaborate this, we can see madness is what is endemic to culture, politics, mass movements, cults, crowds. The entire history of crowd theory, for instance, is about the irrationality of crowds, or conversely, about a perverse rationality that sets in when a crowd is convinced that the only rational form of behavior is to sacrifice yourself for the fatherland or sacrifice someone else for the fatherland. So this kind of madness is completely compatible with technoscience and rationality. Mental illness is the medicalized sphere in which somebody is singled out as having certain symptoms, psychosis, neurosis, schizophrenia, those terms all from the DSM, but they do cross over into the sphere of madness as well, most notably that last word, paranoia. If you read Richard Hofstadter's great essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, I think you'll see that clinical terms, psychosis, for instance, or narcissistic personality disorder, which has big chapters in the DSM, can cross over into the real world. Donald Trump, for instance, the American Psychiatric Association, back at the beginning of his presidency, pronounced him as a malignant narcissist with a psychopathic lack of empathy. Is he mentally ill? Probably, but not curable. It's very, very difficult to cure people with personality disorders of that kind. In fact, the line between madness and badness is very thin. So what is there besides madness? What is the normal? Georges Canguilhem, one of Michel Foucault's professors, wrote this great book on the normal and pathological in medicine. But it's a book that has been studied and read well beyond the world of medicine to try to understand what is it we mean when we talk about disease, when we talk about illness, mental or physical, and what is normality? Clearly, the pathological is much more picturesque and interesting and complicated. The normal tends to be sort of boring. So most of the emphasis in medicine, of course, is on the pathological. And medicine has two models that Canguilhem talks about, two models of disease. One is as something that comes from the outside, that enters and leaves man as through a door, rather like a virus or a bacteria, the whole germ theory of illness. The other is disease is not somewhere in man, it is everywhere in him. It is the whole man. And this is much more compatible with the notion of madness as a built-in endemic feature of a species. Just to elaborate a little bit on Canguilhem's distinction, the external model is foundational to modern medicine and the whole germ theory. But it's also at a very different level, at the level of the political, the national, at the level of the group. One of the great models for fascism and ethnic cleansing. That is, we cannot have any contact with those people because they carry germs. They are dirty, they are filthy. This was the foundational alibi for the final solution and the Holocaust. It was cleansing, ethnic cleansing. And the word cleansing is not an accident. It has to do with cleaning out of the alien body and replacing it with the healthy body politic. The internal model is the more ancient one. It involved humor theory, the idea that the human body is made up of different parts that have to work together in a harmony. Hippocrates, the founder of ancient medicine, and it has its modern versions in theories of the modular mind, in faculty psychology, the idea that our minds are not one thing. We don't just think. We imagine, we remember, we fantasize. We do lots of things with our minds. So our mentality is a mixed bag. It's a kind of symphony, if we're lucky, of different things cooperating. And in fact, constitutional democracy itself is grounded in faculty psychology. So both of these treat man as inherently vulnerable to disease. In one case, it's invading from outside. In the other, it's a product of disorder internally. Canguilhem goes on to say these two conceptions have one point in common. In disease, or better, in the experience of being sick, both envision a polemical situation, either a battle between the organism and a foreign substance, or an internal struggle between opposing forces. Needless to say, there's not a sharp line between these two. And the internal struggle between opposing forces is the bodily equivalent of a civil war. The other model, the external model, is the invaders, the illegal immigrants coming in, carrying, and I think you'll remember the frequent speeches by our former president talking about all of the bad things that immigrants are bringing with them. So what is the cure for this fundamental character of the human animal? One answer traditionally has been, well, we need to become reasonable. I always love to quote back to them Kant's remark from the Critique of Pure Reason, that, and this is pure reason, not practical reason. Kant says reason does not follow the order of things as they present themselves in appearance, but frames for itself with perfect spontaneity, an order of its own according to ideas, to which it adapts the empirical conditions, and according to which it declares actions to be necessary, even though they have never taken place and perhaps never will take place. Pure reason, as opposed to practical reason, it is an extraordinary, Kant calls it a passion. And you can see it in mathematicians, in logicians, but you can also see it in designers of final solutions who think they have the key to produce a final cure of the human condition. So I'm going to come out of the PowerPoint for a while and try to wrap up here. Ultimately, it looks then as if madness, the big circle of our Venn diagram, is a psychosocial phenomenon that is foundational to political systems and not just to the individual body or mind. That's why traditional models of political governance and sovereignty are so routinely grounded in structures designed to control the human tendency to disorder. Monarchy, based on the analogy with the patriarchal and matriarchal family, is the most traditional method of installing a symbol of national identity and collective political consciousness. It's closely allied with other forms such as aristocracy, oligarchy, and tyranny, whether tribal and feudal or modern and nationalistic. Aristotle's Politics celebrates Athenian democracy. At the same time, it makes it clear that Athenian democracy depends upon subordination of women in the household and slavery. I also think of Bob Dylan's wonderful song, "You Gotta Serve Somebody," which shows human societies as organizing themselves in structures of subordination, architectures of power, and leader-follower relationships. But what about democracy? Winston Churchill famously observed, "It's the worst possible form of government, except for all the others." From its very foundations in Enlightenment philosophy, democratic constitutions have been designed to transfer the principles of a healthy individual psyche with its faculties, say, of reason, judgment, and will, to collective forms of self-governance. The American Constitution is fundamentally a mental health document, grounded in a division of powers or faculties in the form of the legislative, that is the reasoning, the judicial, the judgment, and the executive, the will of government. So the body politic expresses its own mental health in the balance of powers. Democratic constitutions are thus a precarious balancing act. And we mustn't forget that the founding fathers, the writers of that constitution, were themselves all slave owners, and that women could not vote, that it was not a democratic society. It was an aspirational document that applied to a very limited part of the population. That limited part is called the demos, the citizens who can participate in the government. So democratic constitutions are precarious, vulnerable to the imbalance of the faculties, and most notably, and most dramatically recently, by an executive branch that seeks absolute tyrannical power, or by a judiciary open to bribes and partisanship, and a legislature that stymies itself into indecisive impotence. That is, it's so divided it can never decide anything. The Founding Fathers accordingly denounced parties and partisanship as an inherent threat to democracy. How the two-party system ever got installed as foundational to our constitutional order is one of the great mysteries of American politics. What the Founding Fathers perhaps did not foresee so clearly is that racism and nationalism exploited by parties and factions present the constant threat of insurrection and civil war. Is it only an irony of history that the party of Abraham Lincoln and Dwight Eisenhower has now evolved into the party of white supremacy, oligarchy, and tyranny in the long march of republicanism from Nixon's Southern strategy to Reagan's reduced government to Donald Trump? Calls for social and political unity coupled with refusal to accept election results, sustained by systematic lying to groups of followers, provides the most vivid contemporary image of cynically managed forms of collective madness. So collective madness is not something that just happens to befall a community. Gaslighting and propaganda, the big lie, the technique of driving people crazy is the time-honored technique of demagogues and tyrants who then designate themselves as the sole voice of reason and truth and consign forms of realism like science and journalism to the domain of fake news and the enemies of the people. The power of the mad sovereign mirrors and depends upon the cultivation of collective delusion among the mass of his followers. Machiavelli famously argued in The Prince, sometimes it's a very wise thing for the sovereign to simulate madness, or perhaps to stimulate it in his subjects. For Machiavelli, the virtue of the prince has nothing to do with moral virtue. It's purely a matter of strength, power, and force of will, exerting unbridled authority over the masses. So what is to be done? Let me just wrap up by coming back to the question of the demos and democracy. If I had time, I would take a detour into the most kind of minor and discredited political theory we have, and that's anarchism. One of the paradoxes of anarchism is that everybody associates it with madness, with assassins and with wild, chaotic crowds. That's what anarchy looks like, and we've seen it. An insurrection depends upon the tactical use of anarchy. Anarchism itself as a philosophy, a political philosophy, is relentlessly rationalistic. It believes that human beings can live together peacefully. It believes not in capitalism, but in what they call mutualism. That is where people take care of each other and learn to live without having people to tell them what to do. It's therefore dismissed as a completely utopian political philosophy. But I think it's there as a kind of 1% super ego haunting democracy, that if democracy really worked, it would be close to the ideal that anarchism proposes of a rational, self-governing electorate, the demos, which would include everybody, in a constitutional order that would produce peace, prosperity, and would not go around extinguishing all the species around it. But I don't have time to really get into anarchism. That's just a footnote. So what about the demos? Right now, we're living in a period in which the demos is on everybody's mind because it is the root word of the condition we've been living with for the last year. That is pandemic, a disease which affects the entire population. You may have noticed that one of the fake answers to the pandemic was proposed by the Trump administration a few months ago. It was called herd immunity. The herd is the opposite of the demos. The herd is the sheep who are led to the slaughter. The sheep, the crowd that can be led in any direction by, for instance, a QAnon shaman or Proud Boys or Oath Keepers. The demos is reflective. The demos makes decisions for itself. So I would just suggest to you that we are living in a period characterized, and remember Nietzsche's remark, it's not only groups, parties, and nations, it's epochs that are, as a rule, insane. There's no doubt that we live in an epoch. That's what it means to think, oh, this time is really different. The pandemic has produced an epoch. And at the same time, other forces have converged and become evident. So I want to suggest that there are 4 different kinds of demos that are in crisis in our moment. And that's why this issue of species madness has become, in some sense, so obvious to us now. There is the pandemic, which is going to last for maybe another year. It is the epoch in the sense of a very decisive short period. But then there is what's called the endemic condition. The endemic is what always is there as a kind of underlying condition. Human beings, like any animal, are not perfect. We have flaws in our design, errors in our DNA. There are mistakes. One of the mistakes in our DNA is clearly this tendency, which goes back 70,000 years. We like to wipe things out. We like to push things away from us, to clear forests, to cut down trees, and to cut down other organisms and get them out of our way. Right now, huge numbers of insects are disappearing. At the same time, there is this endemic condition known as racism, which is particularly important in this country, but is everywhere. The notion of caste seems to be endemic to the species. So this is a part of our madness that has to be recognized as it's not in one epoch or another, but it came to the surface during this epoch in the event of the George Floyd murder in Minnesota last summer, which produced a worldwide reaction against the racist murder of Black men, primarily in this country. The third demic that I think is undeniable is what I would call the infodemic. And this is where you might just call it in most simple terms, the big lie. The use of social media, which were supposed to produce, if you remember the nostalgia back in the 90s, the utopian thought was social media were going to produce a new kind of community, a global village. Marshall McLuhan predicted it. People forgot that Marshall McLuhan said, villages are very nasty places, watch out. The social media have produced niche audiences, which can be driven crazy by systematic disinformation. So the infodemic, gaslighting, propaganda, and the deliberate misleading of large populations. In other words, transforming them from a demos into a herd that can be led to the slaughter. So that's the third one, the infodemic. And the fourth, finally, is the longest range of all, and that is the planetary condition I want to call the ecodemic. That is climate change, which we have just in the last week seen the results of not being prepared for it in Texas. The craziness of a modern country like this suddenly collapsing. People are still lined up for food and water in Texas. And it's because there's been a systematic infodemic denying the ecodemic, denying that climate change exists, which you could see on the news every night as the Republican Party announces that they're going to oppose somebody for Biden's cabinet because they are against fossil fuels. Hello, fossil fuels are the fundamental driver of the ecodemic, the thing that is destroying the planet that we live on. So, last couple sentences here, and then my grandson, who is sitting in, can go off to bed. Is there a cure for all this? I think no. I think it would be better if the human species recognized that it is incurable. Rather than imagine, because every time the human race has tried to cure itself of something, it's tried to do it by expelling something or destroying something, usually other people. The final solution, or genetic engineering. Let's try to design a better person. I think we've got to start over at the bottom with education. As everyone knows, all children are instinctive anarchists up till at least 8 years old. They are filled with creativity, poetry, they can do anything. And then we tell them sometime around 8, 9, 10 years old, oh, you're not good at math. Oh, you can't do music. You're not a poet. Yes, they are. They all are. And we should be doing that with our children. So I think we need to recognize that we are stuck with man as the mad animal, not Homo sapiens. That's why we need to learn to see through the madness of our species as an empirical reality, a critical framework, and a work in progress to be seen through to something beyond itself. Our species needs to evolve by way of a second enlightenment that will take us beyond capitalism, racism, and even beyond techno-scientific rationality as an endless race to keep up with our self-destructive impulses. Our technoscience is now catching up with the virus, but we can't keep playing catch up. We've got to change the conditions under which viruses like this continually evolve and are going to finally replace us. At that point, we will see that saving ourselves and our planet are one and the same thing. Thanks very much. I hope that didn't go on too long, and I'm delighted to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. I can see your grandson is still awake. I'm listening to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's way past its
Yeah. So that's wonderful, Tom. I mean, there's so much to talk about at this moment. I think there are a few prompts that have come my way. At the same time, I also have a few things to talk to you about. Although it is getting late into the night, I can understand that. I think one thing that I was thinking about, and when you were talking, is that when you spoke about the normal madness of human species, and I like that expression about normal madness. It does really have a sort of a zing of an oxymoron, and I was just thinking whether you would have something to respond by saying, or how is that this normal madness can be responsible for, say, self-extinction? Human self-extinction, do you think it's connected to our normal madness? Rather than we psyching ourselves up to go mad, or rather be provoked by something external to us to go mad, how is this normal madness very inherent in us, or probably in a sense slightly ontological? How is that responsible for self-extinction? How do you see that?
Well, first, let me just say something about the idea of normal madness in individuals. I think we all recognize that human beings, none of us are perfectly rational creatures. None of us manage ourselves perfectly or govern our emotions. Erasmus, in Praise of Folly, said, in fact, it's a good thing that human beings are crazy, because otherwise they wouldn't reproduce. They'd never fall in love, which is a completely crazy thing to do. Falling in love, he said, and Plato also regarded love as one of the kind of primary forms of madness. The part that makes normal madness, I think, dangerous to ourselves and others, that sense of or being a threat to ourselves, is when normal emotions like suspicion of the other, hatred, that fear of the Neanderthal boy really haunts me. And I think it was very clever of Harari to introduce it, because, I mean, what he's saying is our species survived by wiping out rivals that were not even like completely other. They looked similar. You could reproduce with them. You could have sex with the other. But that tendency in the human animal to regard creatures that look like us but are not us for some reason, their skin is a different color, their faces and lips are a different shape, they speak a different language, they come from a different place. That itself, the fear of the other, seems to be built in. That's endemic. And so we have to take account of that. That's why the old notion of affirmative action is so foundational. It's a kind of compensation for a built-in suspicion of the other that we have to fight against. So I'm not so sure it can be cured. I think the perception of otherness, that something is like us but not us, is just foundational to whatever it is to be conscious as a human being, that there are other minds out there. And that's why I'm suggesting I don't believe in some big master cure. I don't think technoscience can re-engineer us to be okay. We've got to do it politically.
Okay, and before I really pursue this discussion with you, little father, there are a few questions coming my way now. There is Obhirupa Rai, one of our PhD students in the department. She has a question for you, Tom. She says that I'm anxious to know if madness is a social threat, then where do we locate the present discussion on madness on the social map?
I'm not sure I'm getting the question. Why am I? Repeat it?
She writes this way: I'm anxious to know if madness is a social threat. Now, then, where do we locate the present discussion on madness on the social map? I mean,
where do we locate it on the social map? I mean, that's the place where it is. It seems to be endemic to the formation of societies to define themselves as us and them. That which belongs to us and that which does not. And that which does not belong to us is that which can be swept aside, can be exterminated. Nietzsche's remark about groups, parties, and nations, where he says, insanity in individuals, rare, most of us function quite well, but get them together in a crowd, they go crazy. I think it's kind of conspicuously obvious in a lot of the mass behavior that we're seeing, at least in the United States these days, but not only in the United States, where people gather together who, when they go back to their homes, they're probably perfectly rational, nice folks. Take care of their pets, they're kind to their animals. This, by the way, is legendarily true in the guards at concentration camps would go home at night and play with their children. They weren't crazy, but they participated in a machine of madness, of extermination. So that was highly rationalized. But it was a mad project. The idea of cleansing the German people by eliminating all foreign elements. And it's had its kind of revival. in our time over the last 4 years. You've seen what has happened to the land that was built by immigrants, the United States, turning into a place that separates children from their mothers at the border. I mean, still thousands of children who have been separated. All this done by people who, I'm sure, when they went home at night, you know, they kissed their wife, they played with their pets, they were individually fine. But when they entered into that machine, they became, it overcame all kinds of moral scruples they would feel otherwise.
Right, right. One more question for you here. It's Ivana Chaudhary asking a question. She's thanking you for your brilliant talk, and she points out that there is the concept of the infinite cube and light. And if you can show us that how it is combined with Ptolemaic maths and structure theory. I mean, I would ask Ivana probably to explain this questions a little more, because I think it's a pretty congested question about.
Can she type it out in the chat?
Yes, I think it's better. I would request Ivana, if you are there on the show now. I mean, this question as a sentence comes to me very congested, although I read it out on your behalf. But if you have this question written out a little elaborately for Tom, that would be good. So we move on to the next one. And well, there is David Mather who is asking a nice question, given your connections with Blake, Tom. So that's the question that's coming up. He says that, as thanks for the time zone stretching talk, I offer a quote: like a fiend in a cloud with howling oh, after night I do crowd, and with nights will go. From the Mad Song, I guess, from William Blake. That's yes. That's a command. I would come to pushing the discussion a little more with you here, and that is how can we actually do the crowd behavior? I mean, we were talking about the crowd behavior and psychology, and you were also talking about the crowd behavior and madness, which I really liked. There are two things that's happening here, and which I feel can be connected. For instance, Tom, if you think that, if someone doesn't want to be a part of the crowd behavior, if you're talking about the crowd behavior as hysterical, if you say the crowd behavior is really psyched up, and if a crowd behavior like the way it had with the storming of the Capitol Hill, or any kind of mass revolution that takes place. For instance, if there is someone who decides not to be a part of the crowd behavior, I mean, say, if you consider the crowd behavior, the crowd psychology as something normalized, following on Gustav Le Bon and the rest of the people theorizing on crowd, how does one look at that person who really wants to stay as an outsider to the crowd behavior? And would that person be mentally ill? Would that person be considered mentally ill, that he's not being a part of this democratic movement, not being a part of this normalized crowd behavior? Or is it that the crowd itself becomes mentally ill, a collective category? How would you respond to that?
It's a very interesting question. Of course, the person who refuses groupthink, who refuses to go along with what everybody else is saying and thinking and doing, is often denounced as a renegade, a thought criminal. If the correct way of thinking is being reinforced by the police, remember, 1984 is about thought crime. That's one of the central things. And the telescreen is a way to try to regulate consciousness completely. It is driven by an uncannily familiar technology, namely the telescreen. Remember, the telescreen is both an instrument of spectacle to rouse up the crowd, Big Brother's rallies, and to keep an eye on the crowd, to watch for somebody who is not going along with the crowd. That's why I wish I had put a slide up. I love the opening shot of the film version of Orwell's 1984. Winston Smith is sitting in the corner of his apartment, huddled away out of the view of the telescreen, and he's writing his journal. He's resisting the media. He's trying to stay outside of the spectacle, to ignore it, and also to stay away from the surveillance that's watching it. Well, the world we have created with our machines is now doing that. It is circulating spectacles that entrance us, that enchant us, and it's also keeping an eye on us. All of us now have what information science calls data doubles. That is, there is a version of us which actually contains more information about us than we could probably cough up if somebody asked us. All of our medical records, financial records, our biography, everything. So we live in a society not quite like 1984. It doesn't have the ironclad control of Big Brother. Maybe has multiple Big Brothers. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos. I feel guilty every time I order something from Amazon because I know they're tracking my preferences. They know everything I order. They know what I read. My Kindle is filled with books I've ordered by way of that service. So standing out from the crowd, yes, that can, one version of that, Winston Smith is denounced as being mad because he's not going along with Big Brother. He's doing illegitimate things like keeping a journal and thinking for himself. So he needs to be re-educated, rehabilitated, to be a perfect part of the party-governed society.
Okay. So we have questions coming from my faculty members. So I would request Professor Sengupta, if you can ask your question. After which I will go to Professor Chetri. Professor Sengupta, okay. Are you there?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Ashish from the host department. It's wonderful listening to you. It's a very significant presentation and makes a lot of meaning, in these days. I have often wondered, how to distinguish between madness in an individual or oddities and eccentricities, if you call them, in an individual, and madness of a group or of a mob, as you call it. Because the group is made up of diverse elements, but ultimately making up a homogeneous community. And that community is also curated in terms of rationality, in terms of the visual performance elements through optics, etc. But if you single out an individual, from that group and confront that person and ask them the questions that they might not have considered before joining the group, you may have a very different response. So this individual psychology and behavior and the group psychology and behavior, when that individual joins the group, are very different. What did you say on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's, when we think about group psychology, some people think, well, group psychology must be impossible because after all, a group is made up of all these complicated individuals, each one of which is different and has a different mentality. But what happens, I think most crowd theory, ever since Le Bon in the 19th century, said, no, what happens is when you go into the group, you start to think alike. You start to feel alike. You're swept away by the charisma of the leader or by the mass of the group. So you see this at a football match. Everybody goes there really prepared for frenzy. One of the most archaic forms, Plato talks about bacchanalian madness, when people get together and they all, part of the fun is going crazy together. But groupthink is what you might call an intellectual version of that. It's, of course, a syndrome that's all too common in academia, where we all start to think alike and use the same jargon and cite the same authorities over and over again. So, but it is a homogenizing process. It tends to, and when you return to your individuality, I think it's so important that we have to be part of groups, but we also have to separate ourselves from them to think for ourselves. Nothing terribly profound about that, but seems to me truer than ever today.
Thank you.
Professor Chetri, if you have a question for Tom? Are you there?
I've typed it, but...
Oh, do you want me to read that out?
Yes.
Tom, can you see the question on your screen?
I don't see it.
Okay.
Please read it.
Yeah.
That's what I...
So, Professor Chetri from my faculty, she has a question here. She says that you have spoken about associating madness with groups, crowd, mobs. That is inherently negative within a political framework. However, even within Western cultures, advocates of, say, veganism or deep ecology could be seen as mad in terms of being part of a herd religiously believing in a doctrine. So if there is an ethical dimension behind your framing of species madness, then can we differentiate between a good and a bad madness as far its impact on species is concerned?
Yes, absolutely. I think, in fact, it's foundational to the notion of species madness that there are good and bad versions of it. And sometimes the same kind can be good in one situation and bad in another. But like what I just mentioned, the crowd going crazy at a football match, is that good or bad? I think basically it's experienced as the intense pleasure of feeling along with a mass of other people, feeling the same thing. There is nothing quite like it. Or at a nightclub, when people are dancing together, they're all, they feel like they're part of one body. It's very stimulating and erotic, and I see nothing wrong with that. I mean, this is why, again, Plato lists his 4 positive forms of madness. The prophetic, like Cassandra, who can intuit the future, have visions of possible futures. There's the poetic, the creative side, the madness of the artist. There's a madness of love, which is Erasmus kind of verifies this. Erasmus quotes Plato and says, you know, the human species would vanish if it weren't for the madness of love. That's why we praise folly. We don't just condemn folly. And we see it as an incurable but necessary part of the human animal. So, yes, but here's an example of what you might call good madness, which could be extraordinarily negative. Our normal instinct as individuals is to avoid pain and to avoid danger. If an armed enemy is coming, we go the other way, we get out of it. If we are trained in military discipline, we do not run away from danger. We run toward it. We try to meet it and defeat it. And the ethics, the group ethics of a military unit is self-sacrifice. That is, your life is not as important as the life of the group. And so the groupthink that's relevant for a military group, and this is, by the way, Freud says this in his essay on group psychology and the analysis of the ego. He talks about religion and the military as two places where things that might be otherwise irrational, because you have bonded with a group, they become ethical mandates. To be a good soldier is to be ready to die for your comrade and for your country. So it's a limited sphere, but that's why when I try to invoke the notion of madness as a fundamental concept, it's not in order to reduce everything to one thing. It's to differentiate the incredible variety of things that we do as individuals and groups that from one point of view look bizarre, crazy, exceptional. From another point of view, follow very rigid, strict rules and obey certain values.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tom. I think that in a way winds up things for us today here. And yeah, and I think it's very late into the night on your end there too. We are, of course, well past afternoon. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone who joined in. And thank you, Janice and Carmen, for being there and staying. I know it's a family event, but obviously it needed your patience. And it, of course, needed your support too. So thank you very much, all of you, for being a part of the second Boy Lecture Series. We look forward to seeing you all again in the third edition, which is going to come up next month, and probably the middle of March, where we still haven't decided on the dates, but we are expecting Professor Marty to talk about our new book on infra theme from Chicago Press, just coming out. So we will talk about that. We will stay tuned, and please stay safe in these times. Thank you very much.
Okay, you too, Ranjan. Thank you so much. This was
very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
বন্ধ করে দিন, কিন্তু এটা রিজয়েন করে দিন। হ্যাঁ, স্ট্রিমিং বন্ধ করলে স্ট্রিমিং বন্ধ করেছেন, বন্ধ করো, স্ট্রিমিং বন্ধ করো।